Idanya was already dying before the sun went down. The city had been going wrong for weeks. Rumors, first the kind that spread through military channels like smoke under a door. Protests turned violent. Municipal infrastructure started failing in ways that had nothing to do with the cold. Then the reports stopped being rumors and started being body counts, and the BSAA deployed Alpha Team before the diplomatic window had fully closed. By the time Chris Redfield hit the ground on December 24th, Idanya had the particular smell of a city that had given up trying to save itself. He worked through a collapsed market district with piers flanking left 4 meters back, eyes on the rooftops. The street was a channel of broken glass, and overturned vehicles. Power lines sagged between facades, and somewhere 2 blocks north, something large was burning. The orange glow. Chris kept his pace measured. Not slow, not hurried. The kind of advance that didn't announce itself. Grid 7 is gone. Pierce's voice came flat through the earpiece. Professional, the same register he used whether he was calling a reload or calling a casualty. Bravo lost comms 11 minutes ago. Command thinks they got pushed into the industrial belt. Think or no? Think. Chris didn't answer. He stepped over a man in civilian clothes who was lying very still against a storefront grate, and he didn't stop to check vitals because the angle of the man's neck already told him everything worth knowing. The Javo had been through here. He could tell by the pattern, not random destruction, but a kind of directed violence, bodies concentrated near exits, like something had anticipated where people would run. The C virus worked that way. It didn't just infect. We're pulling toward the eastern checkpoint, Chris said. Piers, I want eyes on that burning structure before we commit to the approach. If it's a vehicle depot, the Java will be using it as cover. Already on it. A pause, then the soft crunch of Piers repositioning. Chris, movement on the roof of the textile warehouse. 2, no 3 contacts, armed. Javo, can't confirm from here. They're not moving like infected. Chris raised a fist and stopped. He pressed into a doorway alcove, scanning the roofline Piers had indicated. 3 silhouettes, yes. Tracking low and fast, using the parapet for cover. But their movements had a quality the infected rarely managed economy. Nothing wasted. Mercenaries. Lot of private contracts floating around Idanya right now. The situation attracts them. It attracts a lot of things. Chris keyed his radio to the secondary channel. Any unit, report your position. Static. He switched back. Keep moving. We'll deal with the roof contacts if they drop into our lane. Flag them for command. I want to know who's running private operations in this grid tonight. They didn't engage. The silhouettes vanished over the far edge of the warehouse, and the roofline went empty. 2 blocks away, Jake Muller was having a significantly worse evening. He had taken the contract 3 weeks ago. Good money, clean brief, or what passed for clean in this part of the world. By the time he understood what Idanya had actually become, extraction was no longer a simple option, and the woman in the tactical winter coat had found him before he found a way out. Her name was Sherry Birkin. She'd said it plainly, like it was supposed to mean something, then showed him credentials that meant she could make his life complicated in ways that would last longer than this particular city. DSO. American government, the kind of department that existed in files marked for limited distribution. She needed him alive, and she needed him mobile. Jake needed the same things for different reasons. They were moving through the basement level of a municipal parking structure when the building above them groaned in a way that had nothing to do with structural stress. A concussive pressure, not an explosion, exactly more like the air in the city, had briefly decided to occupy less space. Sherry stopped walking. Jake stopped a half-second later, hand already on the handgun at his hip. "That wasn't C4, Jake said. "No." Dust sifted down from the concrete panels in thin streams. "That wasn't anything I recognize." "Great. Love that for us." He moved to the east stairwell and took the steps 2 at a time, Sherry right behind him. At ground level, he eased the door open 3 centimeters and looked. The street outside had been a staging area for a small unit of Havo. He'd seen them from the floor above, maybe 8 or 9 bodies, armed and holding a position near a disabled military vehicle. They were gone now. Not retreated. Gone. The vehicle was on its side. The pavement was cracked in a radial pattern from a point roughly in the center of the road, and the cracks were deep enough that Jake could see the utility conduits underneath. Something had hit the ground there. Hard. Jake pulled back from the door. "We're going a different direction. The rendezvous is north." North? She took in the overturned vehicle, the cracked street, the absolute absence of the unit that had been there 90 seconds ago. Her expression didn't change much. She had a way of processing bad information without broadcasting it. Then she said very quietly, "We go north. We go fast and we stay low, and we do not stop." Jake looked at her. "My job is to get you out of Adanya. We can't do that going south. So we go north." Jake Muller had strong opinions about most things, but he had a particular respect for people who made bad decisions clearly and without flinching. He pushed the door open, and Chris heard it before he saw it. A sound like a building deciding to stop being a building. Not the sequential collapse of an explosion, but something more total, a structural failure that happened all at once. He turned east and saw the dust cloud rising above the rooftops, gray-white against the dark sky, climbing fast. "What was that?" Piers was already pivoting, rifle up. Chris was running before he finished the sentence, cutting left through a narrow alley. Piers matched his pace without being told. They came out on a wide boulevard that had been until very recently a functioning evacuation route. A mass of civilians had been pushing through it toward the northern checkpoint. The kind of desperate, compressed movement that happened when people understood they had one direction of the boulevard was wide enough for trucks and lined on both sides with apartment blocks. It wasn't functioning anymore. The flow had stopped. Not dispersed, stopped. The people at the rear were pressing back against the ones behind them, and the ones at the front were doing something that panicked crowds almost never did, which was stand perfect. Chris and Piers came up along the building line and threaded through the outer edge of the mass until they had a sight line north. Chris had spent 15 years encountering things that biology wasn't supposed to produce. He had seen the results of the T virus, the G virus, Ouroboros. He had seen what happened when Umbrella's ambitions exceeded its caution. And he had learned to categorize the things he saw by how dangerous they were and how to kill them. It was a professional habit. It had kept him alive. What stood at the northern end of the boulevard did not fit the category system. It was large. That was the first and most persistent fact about it, an enormity that the eye kept trying to reconcile with the surrounding structures and kept failing to. Green skin over a frame that belonged to something beyond the upper boundary of human scale, with a decay that made the green wrong mottled and dark in patches where it stood in the wreckage of what had been a Javo checkpoint. The barricade reduced to kindling and scattered metal, and it was not looking at the evacuees. It was looking at the space in front of it, the way a predator looks at a field. Not at any single thing, but at all of it, at the volume of available targets, doing a calculation that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with appetite. Then its head moved. The white of its eyes swept across the boulevard, the way a lighthouse beam sweeps across water, not searching exactly. Selecting. Redfield. Piers's voice had dropped to almost nothing. That is not a BOW. No. Umbrella never made anything that size. Neo Umbrella doesn't have the biology for it. I know. Then what? I don't know. Chris had his samurai edge up, which was correct procedure and also almost certainly meaningless. He kept it up anyway. Get on the radio. I need every unit to hold position, and I need the checkpoint north sealed. Nobody goes into that boulevard. Copy. Piers was already moving back, pulling his radio. His voice stayed level. That was one of the things about Piers. He could receive information that redefined the boundaries of a situation and continue functioning inside the new boundaries without the lag that hit most people. Chris had worked with him long enough to trust that the thing at the end of the boulevard made a sound. Not a roar. Something lower than that, more resonant, like pressure changing in a sealed space. People broke in every direction that wasn't north, and Chris pressed flat against the facade to avoid being pulled under by the surge. He watched over their heads as the massive figure advanced. It didn't lunge or sprint, it walked. And the walking was its own kind of terrifying because the pace was deliberate, and deliberate meant it had already decided where it was going. The impact of each step was audible, a rhythmic thud that the pavement transmitted upward through Chris's boots, toward the densest concentration of fleeing people, toward the crowd. Chris made a decision in about 2 seconds, which was longer than it felt. All Alpha units. He was already moving parallel to the boulevard, cutting through the alley to the right. Do not engage the entity at grid 7 north. I say again, do not engage. Priority is evacuation. Corridors open every route south and east and get civilians moving. Abandon the northern checkpoint. Abandon the vehicle depot. We are not fighting this. We are getting people out. Piers caught up with him at the alley's end. His expression asked a question. We can't hold that street, Chris said. We can hold the people. Agreed. Piers checked his rifle, a reflex, and they moved. Behind them, the rhythmic thud continued north. Then it changed direction. Jake pulled Sherry into a doorway as a wave of civilians came down the cross street at a run. Not the organized movement of an evacuation, but the animal urgency of people who had seen something and needed distance from it immediately. He pressed his back to the doorframe and watched them pass. It's moving, Sherry said. She had her triple shot in a two-hand grip, which Jake had a feeling wouldn't matter. He'd heard the sound twice now, that subsonic pressure, like standing too close to a speaker driving too much bass. We need to be somewhere it isn't. The rendezvous is not north anymore, understood. He scanned the cross street. The flow of civilians was thinning. Whatever was behind them was close enough that the fastest people had already passed, and the rest weren't running quite as hard because running was starting to feel pointless. East. We go east and find high ground. Structures might not be stable if... The second story of the structure across the street ceased to be a second story. The wall facing them came apart, not explosively, but structurally, bricks separating from mortar in sections and dropping straight down, and through the gap, left behind something moved. Enormous. Wrong. The scale of it compressed Jake's threat assessment into a very simple output, not stoppable, not engageable, not a problem to be... He grabbed Sherry's arm and ran east. The thing pushed through the structure like the walls were set dressing. Jake didn't look back, because looking back would cost him half a second he didn't have. But he heard it, the continuous, low percussion of its passage, each impact registering in his chest, even at this distance. The street to his left lit orange, and he registered peripherally that an entire block had just become structurally compromised. She was faster than she looked, which Jake noted and filed. They made the end of the cross street and turned south into a service lane barely wide enough for 2 people. The sounds behind them continued for 4 more seconds. Then, they stopped. Jake ran 3 more strides on instinct before pulling up. He turned. The service lane behind them was empty. The blocked line was intact. Silence, except for distant shouting, and the low crackle of the burning vehicle depot 2 blocks west. "Did it?" Sherry started. "Changed direction." Jake was breathing hard, which was unusual enough to be notable. Something else caught its attention. She looked the way they had come. Her tactical coat was gray with brick dust, and her blue scarf had come half loose. She was still holding her weapon. What could catch its attention? In a city full of... To the west, a cluster of emergency lights had activated the automated evac signals the city ran when a district hit threshold casualties. Strobing amber, drawing eyes, drawing movement, drawing anything that responded to density of prey. Something with more people running away. Jake holstered his handgun, which felt like a statement about the situation's reality. Come on, we're wasting the head start. Chris made the evacuation corridor at the old postal sorting building 20 minutes later, with 11 civilians and 2 BSAA privates who had been cut off from their unit. Piers was already there setting up a defensive perimeter with the 3-man element he'd pulled from the northern grid. Chris dropped his pack against the wall. Status. Checkpoint North is gone. Piers handed him a field tablet. The screen showed a thermal map of the boulevard grid, rendered in dull red. I'm reading a heat signature that doesn't match any BOW profile in the database. It tracked through grid 7, then grid 8, then here. He pointed to the eastern edge of the map. It's not on screen anymore. It left the grid, or the thermal is losing it. The signature is inconsistent spikes, then drops, then nothing. Like it's not maintaining a stable body temperature. Chris looked at the map for a moment. Then, he looked at the 11 civilians sitting against the sorting room wall. A mix of ages, a child asleep against an older woman's shoulder. 2 men with the particular blankness of people whose adrenaline had fully discharged and left nothing behind. People who had been trying to go somewhere and had run into something they had no language for. Get a full debrief to command, he said. Everything we observed: size, behavior, movement pattern. I want them to know this. Oh. And the classification. Chris handed the tablet back. Unknown entity. Not of local origin. He paused. Not of any origin I can account for. Piers didn't say anything to that. He turned back to the perimeter and began the methodical work of making a bad position slightly. Outside, Edonia continued making its various sounds, fire, distant collapse, the sporadic crack of weapons being discharged somewhere to the west, where the situation apparently still thought it could be resolved by shooting. The sorting room was quiet. The child slept. Chris stood at the single window facing north and watched the sky for movement. The thermal map had lost its trace. Whatever had come through Grid 7 had decided for reasons that had nothing to do with Chris or his team or anyone's plans to go somewhere with better prospects. He didn't know what that meant yet. He knew that by morning he'd need to find words for it, and that the words were going to be inadequate, and that command was going to want explanations he didn't have. For now, the 11 people in the sorting room were breathing. That was the metric that mattered. The thing about Ustanak was that it learned. Not the way people learned, not from failure or consequence, or the slow accumulation of experience. It learned the way a mechanism learned, iterating its approach each time an obstacle repeated. Jake had figured this out in the first 40 minutes of being hunted through Edonia when the BOW had anticipated his third route change before he'd fully committed to it. That wasn't dumb muscle. That was something patterning him, cataloging exits, tendencies, the geometry of how he moved under pressure. He'd been adjusting ever since. Maintenance corridor. Sherry's voice came from 3 steps behind, completely level despite the pace. Left at the junction, then the loading bay. There's a gap in the fence line on the eastern perimeter. I clocked it on the way in. How wide, Mon? Wide enough? Jake, the maintenance corridor was a narrow concrete channel between two factory buildings. Overhead pipes running the length of it low enough that he had to dip his shoulder twice to clear a valve housing. The cold had made the ground treacherous, a thin rime of ice over old grease, and he adjusted his stride without thinking shorter steps weight forward. Behind them, nothing. No sound, no percussion, no hydraulic whine of the claw mechanism. That was worse. It's not following. It's cutting around. Sherry didn't slow down. It's done this before, goes wide to get ahead. Don't stop. He didn't. They broke out of the corridor into the loading bay, a wide concrete apron, 3 dock doors on the far wall, 2 of them sealed, one hanging open on a broken track. A forklift sat abandoned at an angle near the center, and beyond the apron's edge, the fence line was visible in the amber glow of a sodium lamp. Jake spotted the gap immediately. Sherry had been right. Fence post sheared at the base, the chain link peeled back in a rough triangle, maybe 1.5 meters wide. Enough. He was 12 meters from it when Ustanak came through the sealed dock door on the left. Not through the gap in the door. Through the door. The metal panels buckled outward and then separated, and the BOW filled the space where they had been, its hydraulic claw. It was fast for its size, in the way that some large things were fast, not graceful, but purposeful. Each movement going exactly where it needed to go without excess. It had read the corridor. It had gone around. Right. Sherry was already moving left. Jake was already going right, cutting behind the forklift. It wasn't cover. Ustanak could move the forklift, but the claw's pneumatic hiss reached him as it extended toward where he'd been. Metal connected with the forklift's rear cage, and the machine shrieked across the apron, 3 meters of steel on concrete. Sherry had gone left. She cleared the near corner of the dock and came up along the wall, putting the structural pillar between herself and Ustanak's line of approach. Smart. Jake noted the geometry. She'd forced it to choose a vector, and it had chosen him. He used that. Sprinting wide around the apron's edge, he kept the forklift's wreckage in Ustanak's sightline as long as possible. The BOW recalibrated the shift, came through in its footfall pattern, the brief pause before the pursuit resumed. 1 second, maybe 2. He covered the distance to the fence gap in that window and went through sideways, the chain link catching his coat at the shoulder and tearing a strip free before releasing him. He rolled, came up on one knee, and turned back. Ustanak was 6 meters from the gap and decelerating, not retreating, recalculating. The gap was too narrow for it to use without losing time forcing through. It would find another way around. Sherry. He kept his voice flat, controlled. She came through the gap at a run, ducked low, cleared it clean. Her scarf snagged on the chain link, and she left it without breaking stride, the blue fabric hanging on the... They put 30 meters between themselves and the fence before slowing to a controlled jog. It's not done, Jake said. No, it won't be done until we're off the grid entirely, or one of us is dead. A pause to check her bearings, she oriented by the sodium lamp, then by the distant burning that was still visible above the rooftops to the north. There's a vehicle impound 2 blocks east. If there's anything with keys still in it. A sound reached them from the north. Something else. Jake stopped jogging. The sound was the one he'd heard twice before, that deep resonant pressure, not quite a percussion, not quite a vibration, more like the city briefly inhaling. It moved through the soles of his feet before it reached his ears. He'd cataloged it earlier as unknown heavy movement, and left the category empty because nothing in his experience fit it. That's the thing from before, Sherry said. She wasn't asking. Yeah. To the north, a cluster of emergency strobes had activated the automated evacuation signals. Amber and white cycling in the pattern that meant a district had crossed the threshold for mass casualty response. Jake had seen those signals before in other contracts in other cities where things had gone wrong by more conventional means. Here they had the additional quality of being apparently a dinner bell. The resonant pressure intensified for force. Then the sound of it shifted direction west-northwest toward the strobes, toward whatever density of people the automated system had been designed to guide, and had instead concentrated. "It follows the crowds," Sherry said. It wasn't a question either. Smart for a dead thing. Jake turned east. "Impound lot, let's go." They found the lot, but not the keys. What they found instead was Ustanak, which had apparently been smarter about its alternate route than Jake had given it credit for. The BOW was waiting at the lot's south entrance, not pursuing, just standing its claw arm, hanging at its side, the hydraulic mechanism cycling quietly in the cold air. Patient. It had, Jake realized, hurted them. The fence gap had been the obvious route, and Ustanak had simply been faster. He was genuinely impressed in the way you could be impressed by something that was actively trying to kill you. Jake kept his voice low. "Count. One entrance in, one out, both visible from its position." Sherry's assessment came fast, no hesitation. "The perimeter is 3 meters. I can make it with a run-up. You're taller, you're faster, but it will reach the top before you clear it. So I don't go over." "Then how?" "I go." He nodded at a section of brickwork to the east, where a heavy cargo truck, long abandoned, half buried in snow, had at some point backed into the base and left a stress fracture running from the impact point up to the cap. Old damage. The barrier there would give under the right pressure. "You go over the west end. When it has to choose, it chooses the primary target." "That's you." "That's me." She held his gaze for exactly 1 second, the kind of pause that wasn't hesitation, but was a rapid and professional assessment of whether the plan was stupid or just dangerous. She apparently landed on the second one. She went. Jake gave her 3 seconds, then walked out into the open center of the lot and let Ustanak see him. It moved immediately. No delay, no consideration. When the target was visible and accessible, the BOW closed. Jake ran for the compromised wall, cutting across the lot in a line calculated to put the cargo truck between him and direct pursuit for as long as possible. He heard Ustanak redirect, heard the change in its footfall as it took the new vector, heard the hydraulic claw extend. He hit the cracked section of wall at full speed, leading with his right shoulder, and the brickwork gave, the way he'd guessed it would, not all at once, but in a sequential fracture, the compromised sections separating and taking the sound pressure of his impact outward as much as forward. He went through in an avalanche of old mortar and loose brick and came down hard on the far side, rolling tasting dust, up, moving. His shoulder was going to be a problem in about 20 minutes when the adrenaline cleared. Behind him, through the gap, he'd made the sound of Ustanak, reaching the perimeter, came through the concrete, a heavy impact, then a pause. No stop. It came through anyway. The next street was a wide commercial road, empty except for 2 overturned vehicles and a scattering of abandoned personal belongings, luggage, a child's bicycle, the detritus of people who had been moving faster than their possessions. Sherry was already there, positioned at the corner, watching north. Jake came around at a run and pulled up beside her. "It's still," he started. The section of brickwork behind them exploded outward. Not the section Jake had cracked. The entire 10-meter span to the left of it, Ustanak had chosen to make its own breach larger and requiring less negotiating than the one Jake had provided. The BOW stepped through the rubble without slowing its claw, tracking its head, orienting on Jake, with the mechanical certainty of something that did not experience doubt. 40 meters. Jake put himself in front of Sherry without deciding, to pure instinct, the kind that preceded thought, and brought his handgun up because it was what he had. And what he had was, in this specific matchup, essentially a gesture. 30 meters. The ground vibrated with each of Ustanak's strides. Then it vibrated for a different reason. The resonant pressure returned, but it came from directly above the adjacent block, and it came with a shadow, something occluding the ambient glow of the fires to the east, something with mass enough to displace the light. Jake had time to register the shadow's scale before the source of it landed on the far end of the commercial road. It didn't land like a person lands. It landed like a problem. The impact cratered the asphalt in a rough circle 3 meters across, and the shockwave traveled outward through the ground fast enough that Jake felt it in his knees before the sound reached him. Ustanak stumbled, which was something Jake had not seen the BOW do in 40 minutes of pursuit, and its claw arm swung out for balance, connecting with the chassis of one of the overturned vehicles and sending it skidding. The thing that had landed straightened up. Jake had seen it only briefly before, a distance through smoke and the crush of fleeing people. Up close or closer, 60 meters. Was not exactly intimate. The scale of it was different. Not just larger than a person, but differently large. The way certain phenomena were differently large, the gap between big and this was not a matter of degree. White eyes that didn't track like eyes should track, not searching. Just zeroing in, drawn forward by something beneath cognition, the blunt pull of appetite given scale. The decay gave it a wrongness that went beyond the visual, something the hindbrain registered before the conscious mind caught up. It had not landed here because of Jake. The evacuation strobes to the west had apparently offered something more concentrated, and it had been moving toward them when its trajectory brought it through this block. Ustanak, to its credit, did not hesitate. It turned from Jake and oriented on the new target, which was either a combat response or the closest thing a BOW had to a survival instinct. The claw came up. The hydraulic mechanism built pressure with a... The thing looked at Ustanak the way you look at something in your path. What happened next took less time than it takes to describe. The claw drove forward. One massive hand came across, not a block, not a dodge, a correction, the kind of movement you used on something that was in the wrong place, and the claw's hydraulic arm bent at an angle it was not designed to bend at. The sound it made was metal making a decision it couldn't take back. Ustanak was pulled forward by the redirect off balance, and the follow-through was a single motion that covered the distance between them and ended at the facade of the structure on the street's north side. The facade accepted Ustanak's impact and then declined to remain standing. 11 seconds. Jake had been counting without realizing it. The thing that had done this was already turning away, orienting west, orienting toward the amber strobes and the density signals they represented. It had not looked at Jake once. It had not looked at Sherry. They were not apparently the optimal allocation of its attention when something larger was available. Silence. Then from the collapsed north face, a sound metallic grinding, the hydraulic mechanism of a claw arm attempting to cycle through a bent housing. Damaged, disoriented, buried in rubble. But the biological substrate of Ustanak was not the kind of thing that registered this level of damage as fatal. It would take time to dig out. It would take more time to reorient. But it would reorient. "We need to be very far from here," Jake said. Agreed. Sherry was already moving east, her assessment complete. Then, after 4 steps, it didn't need words would have been a delay they couldn't afford. 3 blocks east, in the partial shelter of a collapsed awning, Jake leaned against the brickwork and let the adrenaline begin its withdrawal. His shoulder was registering now, a deep ache from the wall impact that would be ugly tomorrow and was manageable tonight. Sherry was checking a field radio she'd pulled from her jacket compact, encrypted the kind of hardware that DSO issued to people they expected to be in situations where standard comms were compromised. She'd been trying to raise her handler for the last 7 minutes. Static. Then briefly fragments of something not her channel a bleed over from a joint command frequency, the kind the BSAA ran alongside local military attachments in multi-agency operations. Clipped and broken, but the words that came through were clear enough. Sector 9, all units withdraw to Brakenchul Commander. Crackle. Roar. Confirm this is not a biological engagement. Repeat, this is not. Then nothing. Sherry lowered the radio. Her expression hadn't changed, but something behind it had a recalculation, the kind that happened when new information made old assumptions obsolete. Sterilization protocol, Jake said. It's a contingency framework. It means someone with authority over this grid is considering options that don't involve saving what's left of it. Jake thought about the strobes, the crowds, the thing that had followed them west. He thought about how a city that was already compromised could be made to serve as a container if you needed to keep something inside it long enough to make a decision about what came next. Someone's managing this. The evacuation routes, the way they're funneling the checkpoints that are up and the ones that aren't, it's not random. It might be triage, or it might be pushed off the wall. Either way, we need to be out of whatever they're drawing a line around before they draw it. Sherry pocketed the radio. She glanced east toward the impound lot they hadn't gotten to use, and then recalibrated to the route that was actually available. There's an underpass 2 kilometers south. If the road is clear, a sound from the west. The resonant pressure again. Briefly then fading, the thing moving further away. Finding what it was looking for, or finding something closer to what it was looking for. South, Jake agreed. They went. The emergency alert had been running for 41 minutes. Most of the city's phones had received it. At 11:08 p.m., a cascade text automated the kind of message that the municipal system was only authorized to push under 3 specific conditions. The text read, "Biological hazard. Remain indoors. Await further instruction." It had been accurate for approximately 6 minutes before the power grid in the Eastern District failed and the further instruction never came. Leon Kennedy had been in Tall Oaks for 2 hours before the alert went out. He knew what the alert meant, and he knew what it didn't mean, which was that remaining indoors would help anyone. What it actually meant was that someone in a position of authority had decided that the appearance of a response was more manageable than admitting there wasn't one. He pushed through the commercial district with Helena 3 steps off his left shoulder, both of them keeping to the building line. The street was wrong, in the specific way that streets got wrong in these situations, not empty, not full, but carrying a drift of people that had lost its purpose. Walking fast in directions that contradicted each other. A woman sitting on a curb with her hands in her lap, watching nothing. 2 men arguing in front of a pharmacy with its windows already broken. The argument winding down, not because it had resolved, but because both of them, the C virus, did that. It didn't announce itself. It just made the world gradually stop making sense. 3 blocks to the transit hub, Helena set her eyes moving across rooftops and doorways without stopping. If the evacuation point is still functional, it's the best option. He pulled out the city map he'd taken from the visitor center on the way into paper because paper didn't need a signal, and checked their position against the transit hub's location. Straight line, maybe 400 meters. 2 major intersections, 1 underpass. The underpass was the part he hadn't decided about yet. The transit hub had been functional 40 minutes ago, according to the last radio contact from the unit that set it up. What it was now was a problem. Leon read it from a block out. The geometry was wrong. Evacuation points developed a particular shape when they were working, funneled directed people pressing in a consistent direction with authority at the far end giving it structure. People were pushing toward the hub entrance from every approach, and nobody was clearing away from it, which meant nothing was moving through it. "It's bottlenecked," Helena said. "Worse. Look at the back half." He pointed. Beyond the entrance, the interior of the hub was visible through the wide glass frontage, or had been before something had gone through the glass. The interior was dark, and the movement inside it was not the movement of people waiting for evacuation. She saw it at the same time he did. C-virus. The hub's gone. It was already infected when people started arriving. Leon turned to the mass, still pressing toward the entrance, still operating on the assumption that the hub was a destination rather than a trap. 400 people, maybe 500. He did the math on what he could accomplish by himself and came up short. We need to turn the front of this without explaining why.
Masuna,
How? He was already crossing toward the nearest intersection where a traffic control box sat on a pole at the corner. The city's emergency management system ran through these boxes normally locked, but the emergency override panel was standard issue across every municipality that had accepted federal infrastructure funding. He'd used them before. 30 seconds later, every traffic signal within 2 blocks switched to full red, and the pedestrian crossing indicators began cycling an emergency pattern. Not a signal that existed in the normal vocabulary of traffic management, but one that the human eye read instinctively as wrong stop, don't go further. It wasn't a solution. It was friction, enough friction to slow the front of the crowd, to create doubt, to give the people at the edges room to reconsider their direction. "That buys 2 minutes," Helena said. "Then we use 2 minutes." Leon turned to the nearest cluster of people, a family, 2 adults and 3 children. The adults with the specific look of people who had been making good decisions up until tonight, and were now completely out of their depth. He kept his voice flat, authoritative, the register that didn't leave room for questions. "Federal agent, the hub is compromised. You need to go east on Archer State. Don't stop for anything that isn't a uniformed officer. Go." They went. He turned to the next cluster. Helena had already started on the far side of the intersection, working with the same practiced efficiency, not explaining, not reassuring, just directing. She had the right instinct for it. Secret Service trained you to route bodies through pressure, and the skill transferred. It took 90 seconds to redirect the first 24 people. It wasn't enough. It wasn't close. The ground moved. A rhythmic compression hit the ground, something between a pulse and a subsonic pressure front, coming from the northwest at a frequency that Leon's body registered before his mind did. He stopped mid-sentence and turned. A dust cloud was rising 4 blocks northwest, the type that bloomed from sudden structural failure. Above it, briefly visible between the rooftops, something crossed the skyline that had no business being the size it was. Nobody needed further direction after that. The surge made its own decision, which was to go in every direction that wasn't northwest, and the bottleneck at the hub entrance inverted in approximately 8 seconds as everyone who had been pressing forward suddenly pressed the other way. Leon grabbed Helena's arm and pulled her into the recessed entrance of a closed pharmacy as the surge went past. "Same thing as Adanya," Helena said. It wasn't a question. She'd read the after-action summaries, the redacted ones that had come through DSO channels, with half the nouns replaced by classifications. "Bigger," Leon said. "Or the same size. Hard to tell from 4 blocks. What does it want?" He watched the dust cloud shift direction, tracking northwest to north, and he watched everyone within eyeshot track with it in reverse, pulling away from whatever was generating that particular pulse. Same thing everything in Tall Oaks wants tonight, just more of it. They took Archer East for 6 blocks before the freeway overpass forced a decision. The overpass carried 6 lanes of traffic over the commercial district. And under normal circumstances, it was how you got out of the eastern quarter toward the county line. Under current circumstances, it was a parking lot of abandoned vehicles and approximately 300 people who had decided that elevation was safety and were discovering that elevation was just elevation. Leon looked at it from the base and ran the numbers. The overpass was the fastest route east. It was also fully exposed, lit by the emergency generators that were still running on the upper level, and populated by a density of people significant enough to register as a priority target for anything operating on the principle of maximum concentration. Not the overpass, he said. The tunnel under Route 9 is 2 blocks south. It'll add 20 minutes. Helena looked at the overpass, then at the direction the dust cloud had last been visible. She didn't argue. She'd been watching the same things he'd been watching, and she was reaching the same conclusions. Whatever was moving through Tall Oaks tonight responded to the same signals that evacuation points responded to density movement, light noise. The overpass had all of those. They were half a block from the tunnel entrance when Leon's radio caught something not a directed transmission, a broadcast on the emergency management frequency, the channel reserved for situations where someone had decided the people already inside a crisis needed to hear what was about to happen to them. A voice clipped and without effect. All units. This is joint operations. Authorization has been granted for containment level response in Tall Oaks grid. Non-combatants in affected sectors should be advised that response protocols are active. Evacuation window is 30 minutes from this transmission. 30 minutes. A pause. Then, this is not a targeted strike. This is containment. Helena had stopped walking. Leon stopped beside her. 30 minutes, she said. 28 now. Leon, I know. He looked at the tunnel entrance, then at the map, then at the route east toward the county line. "28 minutes, maybe 4 kilometers to clear the containment radius, depending on how they'd drawn it, running carrying nothing on clear roads possible, on roads that currently looked like this, a different calculation. Tunnel, then straight east on foot. We don't stop. We don't pick up additional contacts. We don't try to redirect anyone else." Her jaw tightened. He knew what that meant. She was doing the same math he was, and she was coming up against the same wall, which was that there were people on that overpass who had 28 minutes left and didn't know it. "We can't," he said. Not cruelly, just accurately. She knew. The tunnel under Route 9 was 200 meters of low concrete and emergency strip lighting, the backup power type that gave everything the color of old bone. The C virus had been here too. Leon could tell by the abandoned vehicles near the entrance doors open. Belongings scattered the specific pattern of people who had been walking and then stopped, being able to walk in the way people normally did. 3 of them were still in the tunnel, not people anymore. Not exactly the C virus had progressed far enough that the biological substrate was still ambulatory, but the person operating it was no longer in any meaningful sense present. Leon dealt with them in the way he dealt with things that needed dealing with efficiently and without commentary. And Helena covered the rear and said nothing because there was nothing worth saying. They were 70 meters in when the tunnel vibrated. Not the rhythm, something more total. A sustained pressure that came through the concrete from above and to the northwest, lasting 3 seconds, then 4, then fading. Leon put one hand on the tunnel wall and felt the resonance traveling through it like a signal through wire. "It's on the overpass," Helena said. Very quiet. Leon didn't answer. He counted to 5. The vibration continued, then shifted in character. The rhythm changed, became less sustained, more percussive. The sound of something moving through structure rather than across it. Then it stopped. Silence in the tunnel except for the emergency strip lighting's faint hum and the distant sound of something large and metallic settling into a new configuration. He started walking again. Move. She moved. They came out the far end of the tunnel into a residential street that was quieter than it should have been and darker than it had. The houses on either side were dark, and the only light came from a fire 3 blocks north that was large enough to illuminate the underside of the smoke rising from it. Leon checked the map. 2 kilometers to the county line, roughly. The containment radius, if joint operations had drawn it at the city boundary, was tight but survivable. If they'd drawn it wider, his radio cut in again the same broadcast frequency, but this time the voice was unknown entity grid 7 pushing northeast. Repeat, this is not a biological contact. This is joint ops. Can anyone confirm if the strike package accounts for static? Then nothing. Helena looked at him. He looked at the northern sky where the fire's glow was the only illumination, and where something very large had just changed the outline of the overpass in a way that the overpass's engineers had not intended. "Still moving northeast," he said. "Away from us. For now." He folded the map. 2 kilometers, 23 minutes. Run. They made the county line with 6 minutes to spare. Leon didn't look back immediately. He got Helena past the cordon, a hastily assembled checkpoint with 2 vehicles and 4 personnel who had the particular expression of people who had been told to hold a line and not told what was on the other side of it, and then he turned. Tall Oaks was visible from the county road as a glow. Not a single fire, but a distributed luminescence, a city generating its own light in the wrong ways. The overpass was a darker shape against it, and it was a different shape than it had been an hour ago. 2 of its 6 lanes had separated from the support structure on the northwest end, hanging at an angle that concrete and rebar weren't designed to hold indefinitely. Something had walked across it, and the overpass had registered an objection. The strike, when it came, was precise. Leon had expected it and was still not entirely prepared for the scale of it, the way the glow intensified briefly before reorganizing into something that was no longer a city. The sound reached them 4 seconds later, a compression that he felt in his sternum before his ears processed it. Helena stood beside him and watched it. "The entity," she said after a while. "The radio said it was moving northeast." "Yes." "So it wasn't—" "No, that wasn't for it. That was for everything else." He watched the glow settle into a steadier burn. It was already gone. She absorbed that. The checkpoint personnel had shifted to action, receiving new orders through their own radios, beginning the process of establishing a new perimeter around something that had until recently been a city. One of them approached Leon with a clipboard and the expression of someone who needed information that would make the forms make sense. Leon looked at the clipboard. He thought about what he'd put on it and what would survive the process of going into a database that would eventually be classified at a level most of the people filling out forms like this would never be cleared for. He took the clipboard. He wrote mass casualty event, biological outbreak, C virus variant, secondary event, unknown nature, non-biological, containment action authorized and executed. He handed it back. The secondary event was already northeast. Whatever it was looking for next, it would find it or it wouldn't, but it wouldn't find it here. tall oaks was a box that had been closed, and the thing that made the box necessary was already somewhere else, already hungry, already following whatever signal the next concentration of available targets was broadcasting into the night. Leon turned away from the glow and walked toward the checkpoint. Helena fell into step beside him. Neither of them. The situation didn't require commentary. It required distance, and they were putting it between themselves and what was behind them one step at a time, which was the only method available. Somewhere to the northeast, the woman running Neo Umbrella's field operation in Sector 12 had given the order at 2:14 a.m., and by 2:31 a.m., the results were visible on 6 different camera feeds simultaneously. Ada watched them from a monitoring station she wasn't supposed to be inside, on a system she wasn't supposed to have access to, through credentials that had belonged to a Neo Umbrella logistics coordinator, until approximately 40 minutes ago, when he'd had the misfortune of leaving his terminal unlocked. The feed showed the same thing from 6 angles: people moving. Not fleeing, not panicking, moving with purpose in a specific direction, because the city's emergency broadcast system had told them to. The low-A system ran on infrastructure that Neo Umbrella had quietly patched into 3 months before the outbreak, a modification so minor in the maintenance logs that it looked like a routine firmware update. What it meant in practice was that when Carla's people pushed a signal, every civic loudspeaker in the affected grid broadcast whatever they wanted it to broadcast. Tonight they wanted it to broadcast, "Attention. Emergency evacuation in progress. Proceed to Assembly Point Delta on Renman Boulevard. Proceed immediately." Assembly Point Delta did not exist. Renman Boulevard was a 4-lane arterial that ran straight through the densest residential cluster in Sector 12, and at 2:31 a.m., it contained approximately 900 people walking toward a destination that had been invented 20 minutes earlier. Ada watched the feeds and made a series of rapid assessments. The first, Carla wasn't trying to feed 900 people to Hulk. That would be crude, and Carla wasn't crude. She was trying to create a concentration, a signal loud enough and dense enough that whatever was operating on appetite logic in Sector 11 would register it and redirect, the second it was working. On the feed covering the Sector 11 boundary, the thermal signature that Joint Operations had been tracking for 6 hours was shifting. Not fast. The thing moved at the pace of something that didn't have a concept of urgency, because urgency implied the possibility of missing something, and it had never missed anything. But the shift was there, a slow reorientation, like a compass needle finding north. They weren't steering it. They were making one street louder than the next, and the appetite was doing the rest. The third assessment, the window this created, was approximately 18 minutes, based on the distance and the pace she'd been observing. 18 minutes in which Neo Umbrella's extraction team could move 3 vehicles of material from the facility on Guanghua Road without whatever was in Sector 11 walking through the middle of the operation. 18 minutes was also, she noted, enough time for her to reach Guanghua Road, bypass the facility's secondary access, and take a copy of whatever they were trying so hard to move. She closed the monitoring station's terminal, restored the screen to its previous state, and left the room the way she'd entered it. Through the ventilation access in the drop ceiling, which was slower than the door, but considerably less visible to the 2-man security rotation that was currently prioritizing the perimeter over the interior, because the interior was theoretically already secure. Theoretically. Renman Boulevard, at 2:38 a.m., looked like the orderly version of what Tall Oaks had looked like at its worst. Ada observed it from 3 stories up from the fire escape of a residential block that gave her a sight line down the length of the arterial. The column of people was real. 900 had been a conservative estimate. She was counting closer to 1,200 now. Drawn from surrounding streets by the broadcast, some of them carrying luggage, some, not all of them, moving with the particular directed energy of people who believed someone had a plan. At the far end of the boulevard, Barriers had been set up. Not the kind of barriers that directed people further, the kind that stopped them. Steel hydraulics, the infrastructure that municipalities installed for large-scale crowd management events, and that Neo Umbrella had activated remotely at 2:33 a.m. The column of people was compressing against the barriers, now the front stalling, while the rear continued to feed in, and the density in the middle of the boulevard was becoming exactly what Carla's thermal model required. To the east, an ambulance had been positioned at the intersection of Renmin and Guanghua, not responding to anything, just sitting there, with its lights cycling amber and white, the universal visual signal that said, "Emergency here. Look here." Two more were on side streets feeding into the boulevard from the north, their lights adding to the pattern. It wasn't subtle. It didn't need to be. It needed to be visible from a sufficient distance to a thing that navigated by appetite density, and visible it was. Ada tracked the thermal signature's movement on the handheld unit she'd borrowed from the monitoring station. Sector 11, still, the reorientation had accelerated slightly. The density on Renmin was now registering as the highest concentration in a 3-kilometer radius, and the signature was responding to that fact with the uncomplicated directness of something that didn't deliberate. She had perhaps 14 minutes. She went down the fire escape fast, hit the alley at the base, and turned east toward Guanghua Road. The facility occupied the ground floor and basement of what had been a pharmaceutical distribution center, a building chosen. She suspected because pharmaceutical distribution was a category that explained almost any kind of cargo movement without requiring specifics. The loading dock at the rear was active, 2 vehicles already loaded. A third being worked on by 4 personnel who were moving with the focused urgency of people on a clock they hadn't set themselves. Ada came in from the north side through a ventilation corridor that the building's original architects had installed for air circulation and that Neo Umbrella's retrofitting team had inexplicably left unmonitored. This was the kind of oversight that happened when an organization was simultaneously running 6 crises and prioritizing the one that was actively trying to eat them. She reached the server room in 4 minutes. The room was warm. Active systems recently accessed the kind of heat that said people had been here within the hour. 2 terminals were still logged in. She pulled her extraction device, a piece of hardware that looked like a standard USB drive, and was considerably more interesting than that, and began the copy sequence. The copy would take 6 minutes. She had, by her estimate, 11. While it ran, she moved through the room and read what was on the screens. The first terminal showed logistics transfer manifests, vehicle tracking a destination code she didn't recognize, but photographed. The second was more useful, a map, overlay the kind that tactical operations teams used for asset management, with color-coded markers across a city grid. Green markers were active containment points. Yellow were pending. Red were compromised. There were 47 markers on the map. Tall oaks had been. She could see it marked red now, labeled with a date and a status, sterilized. Asset relocated pre-action. See transfer log 7714. Sector 12. The current operation was green, with a countdown timer in the corner of the overlay. 8 minutes remaining on the operational window they'd calculated, which tracked with her own estimate. She photographed the map. She photographed the transfer logs visible on screen. She noted the destination codes, the vehicle IDs, the personnel designations. Carla's organization had apparently believed that good operational security meant keeping records only on secured internal systems. Which was true except for the part where someone with the right credentials could access those systems from a terminal that had been left logged in. The extraction device finished its copy at the 6-minute mark. Ada pocketed it, restored both terminals to their previous screens, and began the route back to the ventilation corridor. She was halfway there when the building moved. Not the building specifically. The ground under it, a sustained compression that came through the concrete foundation and traveled upward through the floor into the soles of her feet. She recognized the signature. She'd been tracking it on the handheld for the past 20 minutes. She checked the device. The thermal trace was no longer in Sector 11. It was in Sector 12. She ran the numbers. 14 minutes, her estimate. The column on Renmin had apparently been denser than the thermal model predicted, or the signature had been moving faster than her pace calculation assumed, or both. Either way, the operational window had closed approximately 4 minutes early, and she was inside a building that was about to become the wrong place to be standing. The loading dock personnel had reached the same. She could hear it. Not panic, not shouting, but the rapid, purposeful sounds of people abandoning a task mid-execution. Doors, vehicle engines, the particular cadence of an extraction that had been drilled and was now being performed at higher speed than the drill anticipated. Ada moved. The ventilation corridor was 30 meters north. She covered it in 12 seconds, went in, pulled the access panel closed behind her, and kept moving. The corridor ran parallel to the building's north wall and terminated at a utility shaft that connected to the roof. She was 10 meters from the shaft when the north wall of the facility ceased to exist. Not explosively, structurally. The same sequential failures she'd seen in footage from Adanya and read about in the Tall Oaks reports, load-bearing elements, making decisions they couldn't reverse, the wall coming apart in sections from bottom to top as something pressed through it, with the patient indifference of a tide coming in. Cold air flooded the corridor. Ada flattened against the south wall of the ventilation space and held still. Through the gap where the north wall had been, the thing was visible for approximately 4 seconds. She had seen photographs. The photographs were inadequate. Scale was something that images failed to convey accurately, the difference between understanding that something was large and standing in proximity to something that made the surrounding architecture look provisional. Rotting green, the decay wrong in a way that went beyond the visual, white eyes that moved across the space. With the quality of a sensor rather than a gaze, not looking for her. Specifically, not looking for anything. Specifically just registering the available inventory of targets and finding the current location insufficiently populated to warrant attention. The loading dock was behind it. The vehicles were gone. The personnel were gone. The thing had arrived 4 minutes late and had found an empty table. Oriented south toward Renmin Boulevard, toward the density that was still there, compressed against the barriers, lit by the ambulance strobes, exactly where Carla's people had arranged it. It walked through the south wall of the facility without varying its pace. Ada counted to 10. Then she continued to the utility shaft, climbed to the roof, and crossed 3 rooftops east before dropping back to street level. She found a position on the upper floor of a parking structure 2 blocks from Renmin with a clear sightline to the boulevard's midpoint. She arrived in time to see the barriers, not in time to see what had happened before she arrived. She could read it from the aftermath. The hydraulic barriers were open now. The steel retracted the mechanism that had locked 1,200 people against an artificial stop, now cycling in reverse. Someone had released them. Not Carla's people. Carla's people were 2 kilometers away in vehicles that were now accelerating toward a highway ramp, but someone in the municipal system had apparently overridden the barrier control, or the barriers had defaulted to open when the primary control signal dropped. The column was dispersing. Not orderly, not calm, but moving. Splitting into the side streets. Individuals breaking from the mass and running in directions that contradicted each other, the structured geometry of the false evacuation dissolving into the authentic chaos underneath it. Ada watched the thermal trace on her handheld. It had reached the boulevard's midpoint 11 minutes ago. It was no longer there. The signature was shifting again northeast, this time pulling away from the dispersing density of Renmin towards something else. Some other concentration that the appetite had identified as a better allocation. Toward Lanxing, she thought. The signature's general drift had been northeast for 3 hours. Lanxiang was northeast. She put the handheld away and looked at the extraction device in her other hand. 47 markers. Transfer log 7714. Destination codes she didn't recognize yet. She recognized enough. This hadn't started in Tall Oaks, and it hadn't started in Edonia. Those were operational nodes points on a network that had been running longer than either outbreak, longer than the public timeline of the C virus, longer than anyone outside a very small number of people with very specific clearances had been permitted to know about. The thing moving northeast was not part of that network. It had arrived from somewhere else entirely, and it was following its own logic, which had nothing to do with Simmons or Carla or any of the infrastructure they'd spent years building. But it had intersected with that infrastructure tonight, and in doing so, it had done something that Ada had been trying to do for 18 months. It had made them move faster than their protocols allowed. And fast organizations made mistakes that slow ones didn't. She pocketed the extraction device and began the route northeast. Whatever was in Lanxing, she'd need to be there before it was gone. 3 blocks south of Renmin, in a sealed utility substation that Neo Umbrella had converted to a relay point, a server continued transmitting. The transmission was automated, a dead man's protocol, the kind that activated when primary operators failed to check in at the scheduled interval. It broadcast on a frequency that only 3 receiving stations in the world were configured to receive, and its content was a single compressed file, the current status of all 47 markers updated in real time. The file showed 46 green markers and one that had just shifted from green to yellow. The yellow marker was labeled Lanxiang, status active, projected timeline accelerated. Reason unknown, variable non-biological origin unclassified. The transmission continued for another 40 seconds. Then the substation's backup power exhausted itself. The server shut down and the relay point went dark. The 47 markers remained on systems elsewhere in formats. The BSAA had been in Lanxiang for 11 hours before the second disaster arrived. The first one, the biological outbreak. The Javo, the Neo Umbrella infrastructure woven into the city's port authority and transit systems that one they had doctrine for. Imperfect doctrine written for situations that were always different from the situation you were actually in, but doctrine nonetheless. Chris had worked 11 hours inside that framework, and the framework was holding in the way that bad frameworks held. It was keeping his people alive. It wasn't solving anything, and every hour it held required more resources than the hour before. The second disaster didn't. He was at the container yard at the southern port when it registered, not visually, not yet, but through the ground, through the soles of his boots, through the way the stacked containers around him picked up a resonance that their structural mass shouldn't have been capable of transmitting. 40-foot steel boxes, each one weighing 30 tons, and they were vibrating. Piers, I feel it. Piers had his anti-material rifle up, scanning the open ground between the container rows. The yard was lit by sodium floods on 30-meter poles, and the light was flat in total and left no shadows large enough to hide anything that should have been hidden. Coming from the north end, Harbor Gate. How far? 400 meters, maybe less. Moving faster than before. Chris processed that. Faster than the Edonia readings, faster than the Tall Oaks thermal data. Either the thing had a reason to accelerate, or the density of Lanxiang was pulling at it differently than smaller cities had. He keyed the team frequency. All BSAA units in the container yard collapsed to the eastern exit. Do not engage anything that isn't a Javo or a BOW. I say again, if it's large green and not in the database, you do not shoot at it. Move. He got 4 acknowledgements and 1 silence from the unit that had been on the north perimeter, which told him something he didn't want to know about the north perimeter. East, he said to Piers, and they went. The harbor gate gave way at 3:47 a.m. Leon was 4 blocks inland when it happened, and he saw it only as a pressure shift in the air. A concussive displacement that wasn't an explosion, but moved like one rolling south through the port district and rattling windows that hadn't already been broken by the night's earth. He pressed Helena into a recessed loading bay and watched debris drift down from the overhang above them. Concrete dust, a section of corrugated roofing, the shattered lens of a streetlight. Gate's gone, Helena said. She had her Hydra up scanning the approach from the north. Gate's been gone for a while. Leon straightened and checked the route east. They'd been trying to reach a civilian holdout at the Lanxing Grand Hotel, a cluster of 300 people who'd barricaded themselves on the upper floors and were running out of both food and the capacity to hold their position against the infected pushing up from the lower levels. 300 people 4 blocks east, and between them and that destination, the street was now a different problem than it had been 6 minutes ago. From the north, sounds not the staccato of gunfire or the wet sounds of the infected, but something lower, a percussion that the urban geometry channeled and amplified, bouncing between facades until it was directionless, coming from everywhere and nowhere. The acoustic signature of something so large that the city itself was acting as a resonator. Different route, Leon said. The hotel is north-northeast. The hotel is also directly in whatever's coming south from the harbor. The one that didn't require a signal, the one he'd had since Tall Oaks. Lanxiang's street grid was denser than Tall Oaks, more irregular, which was worse in some ways and better in others. Worse because the options weren't obvious. Better because the thing coming south from the harbor also couldn't see the options. We go through the market. The market district had a Javo concentration as of 2 hours ago. Javo I know how to deal with. She didn't argue. They went. The market district at 4 a.m. was a maze of stalls and covered walkways. Most of them dark, some of them burning. Leon moved through it with Helena 6 steps back, each of them working alternate sides of the central aisle, checking sightlines before committing to intersections. The Javo that had been concentrated here 2 hours ago had partially dispersed, some drawn north by whatever had come through the harbor, some deeper into the market's interior. The ones that remained were disorganized, their coordination fractured, which made them dangerous in a different way than organized Javo were dangerous. He dealt with 4 of them in 7 minutes. Helena dealt with 2. Neither of them stopped moving. They came out the north end of the market onto a wide plaza that connected to the hotel's approach road, and Leon stopped at the hotel was visible, a tower of lit windows. The upper floors bright against the dark skyline. The lower floors dark where power had failed or been cut. 300 people up there burning through their remaining resources. He could reach it. The route was clear. He could also see from the plaza the container yard's northern edge 4 blocks west, and the container yard. 3 of the yard's perimeter structures had been relocated. Not collapsed, not bombed, relocated, pushed aside and stacked against each other in a configuration that no crane operator had intended. Between them, a path had been pressed through the yard's interior, wide enough to accommodate something much larger than the equipment the yard had been designed for. Whatever had come through the harbor gate had walked through a working container yard and reordered. "Keep moving," Leon said, and meant it entirely for himself as much as for Helena. 3 blocks west of the plaza, Chris was learning what the container yard looked like from inside it after the fact. He and Piers had made the eastern exit in time. 3 of the 4 units that had acknowledged his order, the 4th unit, the one that hadn't responded, he'd found at the exit point. All 4 members present, none of them requiring medical attention, all of them in the specific condition of people who had been very close to something and survived by a margin they couldn't fully account for. It came through the north gate, the unit lead reported. Her name was Vasquez, 12-year BSA, a veteran, not someone who dramatized her reports. Walked through it, not into it, through. The gate hardware is in 4 pieces, none of them where they started. A pause. It didn't stop. It came through and kept going south. Did it engage the Javo in the yard? The Javo in the yard aren't in the yard anymore. Another pause. Some of them ran. Some of them didn't run fast enough. Chris filed that. The Javo in the container yard had numbered approximately 40 based on the sweep they'd done at 2 a.m. 40 Javo disposed of as a consequence of, not as a goal, not as a combat action, as a side effect of something going somewhere else. What's south of the yard? He asked Piers. Residential. Dense. Piers had the city map on his tactical display, the updated version that BSAA command was pushing every 20 minutes. Field hospital at the Lin Hua Community Center, 3 blocks south. Civilian population estimate 400 to 600. Chris looked at the path pressed through the yard, south. 400 to 600 people in a field hospital, lit up generators, running the maximum possible signal density broadcasting into the night. Get command on the line. He was already running South Piers, falling in alongside him. I need that field hospital evacuated in the next 10 minutes. Whatever they can't walk out on their own, we carry. Chris, 10 minutes is what we have. Go. They reached the Lin Hua Community Center with 8 minutes remaining and immediately understood why 10 had always been optimistic. The field hospital had expanded beyond the community center's walls, tents in the surrounding lot, supply lines running across the access road, a generator array on the east side, loud enough to hear from 2 blocks away. The patient count was closer to 700 than 6. Moving 700 people, a significant portion of them on stretchers or IV lines, in 8 minutes was not a medical evacuation. It was a different category of problem entirely. Chris made the call that the situation required, rather than the one that felt correct. Walking wounded and mobile patients north exit now. He grabbed the nearest person in medical scrubs. A doctor from the ID badge, young, the expression of someone who had been running on the wrong side of capacity for many hours. Anyone who needs a stretcher stays in the interior rooms away from exterior walls. You've got maybe 7 minutes before something large comes through this area. Interior walls are your best option. The doctor looked at him. How large might... To his credit, the doctor didn't waste time asking follow-up questions. He turned and started issuing instructions to the staff around him with the specific compressed authority of someone who had learned to communicate urgency without communicating panic, which was a skill that took years to develop and that Chris was grateful for in this particular moment. They moved 412 ambulatory patients in 6 minutes. It wasn't clean and it wasn't organized, and 3 of them required physical assistance from BSAA personnel who had been allocated to perimeter security. The 291 who couldn't be moved were in the building's interior corridor by the time the ground outside began to register the approach. Chris was at the north exit when Piers grabbed his arm. "Don't." Piers said it quietly, the way he said things when he was very certain. You've done what's possible. Going back in doesn't change the math. Chris looked at the building. The walls will hold, or they won't, Piers said. Either way, it's not a factor you control. The percussion reached the field hospital's block at 4:22 a.m. Chris and Piers were 200 meters north, with 412 people between them and whatever was coming, and Chris counted his steps and kept moving because the alternative to moving was standing still. And standing still accomplished behind them a sound like the city exhaling. Then silence. Then from somewhere south, the faint continued sounds of the night gunfire sirens. The alive, chaotic noise of a city that was still in its damaged way, functioning. The walls had held. Jake and Sherry had been in the metro system for 40 minutes when the ceiling started. Not collapsing, not yet, just deciding. That was how Jake thought about it, concrete, that had been confident about its structural role, suddenly receiving information that made it reconsider. Hairline fractures appeared in the station's vaulted ceiling, tracking from the northern entrance tunnel toward the central platform in a pattern that followed something moving above ground, rather than any internal failure. Dust sifted down in thin curtains. The emergency lighting flickered once held. "It's on the street above us," Sherry said. She had one hand on a support column, reading the vibration through it. "How long has it been tracking east?" "Since we went underground. 40 minutes. She removed her hand from the column. "I don't think it's following us specifically. I think east is where the density is." Jake had reached the same conclusion 20 minutes ago and hadn't said anything, because saying it didn't change what they were doing, which was moving through the metro system toward the eastern. The facility was above ground, which meant at some point they'd have to surface, and surfacing meant choosing a moment when east wasn't where the density was. The ceiling cracked. A section of plaster dropped to the platform in 3 pieces, and the fluorescent tube behind it buzzed, flickered, and settled into a lower register of illumination. "Faster," Jake said. "Already going faster than the conditions recommend." "Conditions aren't great up there either." She glanced at the ceiling at the new fracture pattern spreading from the existing cracks and made the calculation visibly. He could see it in the half-second before she answered. "Agreed. Eastern interchange. Run." They ran. The vibration followed them for 4 stations, then faded. At the 5th station, the ceiling was intact and the dust had settled, and the emergency lighting was steady. Jake stopped running and listened. The percussion, whatever had been tracking east above them, had found its east and was now occupied with it. "Surface," he said. "Thank." Ada surfaced 11 minutes ahead of them at a utility access point 3 blocks from the facility she'd identified from the Guanghua Road data. The facility, a converted warehouse near the eastern port, was active. She could see it from the rooftop. She'd chosen lights in the interior vehicles, at the rear loading area personnel, moving with the efficiency of people who had been told the window was closing, the 47th marker from Carla's map. The one that had been green when the server went dark. It was still green. Barely. She went in from the north through a gap in the perimeter fence where a vehicle had been backed through and never repaired, and reached the facility's east wall in 90 seconds. The east wall had a ventilation panel at the 3-meter mark she used, the hookshot to reach it, went in and was at the server cluster in 4 minutes. The data she found there was different from Guanghua Road. Guanghua had been logistics movement timing volume. This was research viral load calculations, host compatibility matrices, the technical documentation of what the C virus had been designed to become, rather than what it currently was. She copied it without reading it, because reading it would take time she didn't have, and understanding it could happen later in a location where the building wasn't at risk of being walked through. She was at the perimeter fence on the way out when she found the secondary server, a stand-alone unit physically separated from the main cluster, connected to nothing except a cellular transmitter. It was broadcasting. She intercepted the signal long enough to read the header. Destination 3 receiving stations. Classification Omega. She copied the header, flagged the physical location of the transmitter for a follow-up she'd arranged through channels she wasn't going to specify here, and moved. The facility was 2 blocks behind her when the eastern port's skyline changed. It happened in stages. First, the lights, the sodium floods along the harbor's working piers, each one going dark in sequence from north to south. A cascade that took 11 seconds and left the eastern waterfront in darkness except for the running lights of the vessels still moored there. Then the sounds from the harbor shifted the normal ambient noise of a working port at night, replaced by something lower. Something that the water itself was transmitting a pressure moving through the harbor basin from the inner anchorage toward the outer breakwater. Ada stopped walking and looked east. At the harbor's edge, briefly visible against the darkness of open water, something stood at the breakwater. The scale of it compressed distance. It looked close, but the breakwater was 800 meters from her position, which meant the thing standing at it was registering at that range, because it was simply that large. It wasn't moving toward the city. It was looking at the water. 40 seconds. She counted. It stood at the breakwater for 40 seconds, and during those 40 seconds, the harbor was completely silent. No vessel movement, no crane operation, just the water and the thing looking at it. Then it stepped off the breakwater. The displacement hit the harbor's inner basin as a wave. Not massive, not catastrophic, but visible, a meter-high surge that pushed against the moored vessels and set them rocking on their lines. The running lights bobbed. The water settled. The thermal signature on her handheld showed a trace heading east, northeast into the harbor, into the channel, then deeper, then nothing, or the device lost it. Either way, the signature was gone. Ada lowered the handheld. East, northeast, open water. And beyond the water, eventually, whatever else was out there, other coastlines, other cities, other concentrations of the thing, it was always looking for. She looked at the devices in her hands, the extraction unit with the Guanghua data, the intercepted transmission header, the research files from the eastern warehouse. Enough to begin dismantling what Carla had built. If she moved carefully and didn't allow the evidence chain to be cut before it reached the people who could act on it. The city behind her was still producing its various sounds. The alive, damaged, ongoing noise of Lanxiang, not quite finished with the night. Somewhere in that noise, Chris and Leon and Jake were still doing whatever the situation required. She didn't know exactly where. She didn't need to. Her timeline was as short as she could make it. She went. The containment protocol had been designed by people who understood crowds. Ada had read the documentation, 40 pages of operational planning pulled from the Guanghua road server, now on the extraction device in her jacket pocket. And she'd spent the cab ride northeast in a vehicle she'd borrowed from a parking structure without asking. Reading it with the focused attention of someone who intended to use it against its authors. The protocol was it accounted for human behavior under stress. The tendency to follow authority signals, to move toward light and sound in darkness, to compress into groups when frightened. It had systems for directing that compression broadcast infrastructure barrier networks, calibrated lighting arrays, and systems for exploiting the compression once created. Sector by sector, the protocol could funnel 12,000 people into 6 holding zones, seal the zones, and initiate sterilization on a rolling basis while logging each action as emergency containment procedure in records that would survive any subsequent investigation. It was reflected a very good plan for killing a great number of people in a way that looked administrative. What it hadn't accounted for was an appetite that didn't respond to administrative signals. The protocol's authors had assumed a world where the largest variable was human behavior. They'd built their systems to manage humans, to direct them, concentrate them, use them. The thing that had come through the harbor gate at Lansheng hadn't read the protocol. It concentrated where the food was, which was sometimes where they'd arranged the food to be, and sometimes not. And the gap between those two states was where everything fell apart. She reached the target facility at 4:58 a.m. The facility was a converted freight forwarding office on a side street, 2 blocks from the Eastern Port secondary gate, 3 stories exterior. Cameras on a 40-second rotation, a security team of 4 that had been reduced to 2 when the other pair were reassigned to the harbor perimeter after the breakwater event. Ada had been watching the camera rotation from a rooftop across the street for 6 minutes before she crossed. The gap between the camera's sweep and the door's line of sight was 11 seconds. She used 9 of them. Interior dark except for emergency lighting in the stairwell, the orange-red of backup systems that told you power had failed without telling you when it would return. She went up rather than down server infrastructure in a building this size was typically on the upper floors away from flood risk and street-level intrusion. The second floor was storage crates, equipment cases, the physical logistics of an operation that moved things it didn't want traced. The third floor was what she needed. 2 terminals, 1 standalone unit with a cellular antenna, 1 wall-mounted display showing a map she recognized. The same 47 markers, updated, 31 green, 12 yellow, 4 red. The red ones were the sterilized site's tall oaks, 2 locations she didn't have names for, and now a 4th that had been added within the last hour. The coordinates placed it 3 kilometers south of her current position. She cross-referenced against the city map in her memory residential district, dense the area that had been directly in the path of whatever had come through the container yard, not a sterilization decision. A cover story retroactively applied to destruction that had already happened by other means. She photographed the map, connected the extraction device to the primary terminal, and started the copy sequence. 40 seconds. She used the first 20 to photograph everything on the standalone unit's screen transmission logs. Recipient codes, a scheduling document that listed dates and coordinates for 8 future operations, the nearest of which was 48 hours away. At the 23-second mark, the building's PA system activated. A voice-automated flat, containment protocol active. All personnel evacuate via designated routes. This is not a drill. Ada kept her eyes on the extraction device's progress bar. 60%. She heard the stairwell door open on the floor below. Footsteps, 2 people moving fast, the specific cadence of someone following an evacuation route they'd memorized. They went down rather than up, which meant the extraction team was using the ground floor exit. 70%. Through the 3rd floor's single window facing east, she could see the port's secondary gate. The gate was sealed blast doors, the heavy hydraulic type that took 90 seconds to cycle open, installed presumably to stop vehicle intrusion, and now serving a secondary function as a wall between whatever was in the port district and whatever was in the street grid behind it. The doors were vibrating, not from the mechanism, from the other side. 85%. She counted. 3 seconds of vibration, then silence, then a different quality of silence, the kind that preceded reclassification. Whatever had pressed against them from the port side had encountered resistance and was running its own calculation about whether this particular resistance was worth the time to overcome, given that there were other options available in other directions. 92%. The calculation resolved. She heard it in the change of pressure, the vibration shifting, the frequency altering as something very large changed its angle of approach, not toward the blast doors, away from them. It didn't stop. It rerouted. 100%. She pulled the extraction device, pocketed it, and was at the stairwell door. And the evacuation team had left the ground floor in a hurry that was legible. In the details, a chair knocked sideways, a tablet left on a desk. With its screen still active, the rear exit door hanging open on its hydraulic closer. Cycling slowly back toward the frame. Ada went out the rear exit into the service alley behind the building. The alley ran east-west. To the west, 2 blocks, the blast door was visible over the rooftops, still sealed, still intact. To the east, the alley connected to a service road that ran along the port's secondary perimeter. She went east. The service road was empty. The sodium floods along the port perimeter where dark power to this section had cut at some point in the last hour, and without the floods, the only illumination came from fires in the port's interior and from the running lights of vessels that had somehow maintained position at the inner anchorage despite the harbor event. She stopped at the perimeter fence and looked through it into the port. The secondary gate's blast doors were intact. The section of fence 50 meters north of the gate was not. Something had pressed through it, not explosively, not with the catastrophic violence of a demolition charge, but with the patient force of something that had encountered a barrier and simply continued applying pressure until the fence poles were bent at angles that steel didn't normally achieve without significant heat treatment. On the far side of the fence gap, the port's interior was visible container stacks, crane gantries, the flat geometry of a working industrial facility. Empty. The Javo that had been concentrated in this sector 12 hours ago were gone. The BSAA units that had been sweeping the sector were gone. The extraction team that had been operating out of the freight forwarding office was gone. Whatever had pressed through the fence had already pressed on to somewhere else. 4 blocks west, in a mobile command unit that Neo Umbrella had positioned in a parking structure before the night's events had made repositioning impossible, 3 people were having a conversation that Ada was not supposed to hear, and was hearing anyway through the relay she'd attached to the unit's antenna during the 6 minutes she'd spent on the rooftop. Sector 9 is unresponsive. A man's voice controlled the register of someone who had been trained to deliver bad news without inflecting it. The team at the freight forwarding site has not checked in since the protocol activated. The site is sterilized. A woman's voice. Carla's voice. Ada had recordings for comparison, and the match was close enough to be certain. Negative. Protocol-activated personnel evacuated, but the sterilization trigger wasn't confirmed before comms dropped. Unknown. The terminal showed an active copy sequence in the last transmission, then went dark. Another pause longer. Find out who was in that building. Ada noted the timestamp on the relay recording and moved on. She had what she needed. She had what she'd come for, and a significant amount more. The scheduling document, with 8 future operation coordinates, the transmission logs with recipient codes. The map with 47 markers updated in real time. The copy of the sterilization authorization chain that would take a sufficiently motivated analyst approximately 4 hours to trace back to the signatures that had issued it. She had enough to dismantle the network. Not immediately. Immediately required infrastructure she didn't have access to yet, and people she trusted of whom there were a limited number. But soon. The relay picked up Carla's voice again one more time before Ada moved out of range. Accelerate the Lansheng timeline. If the site is compromised, we consolidate. 48 hours. 48 hours. The same window she'd seen on the scheduling document. 2 days to reposition everything before whoever had that extraction device could weaponize it through the right channels. Ida went northeast. At 5:31 a.m., the parking structure where the mobile command unit was parked, the automated sterilization trigger for Sector 9 activated. Not the freight forwarding office. That trigger had been tied to a confirmation handshake that never came through because the terminal had gone dark mid. The trigger that activated was the secondary one. The redundancy protocol, the failsafe built into a system designed by people who understood that humans made mistakes under pressure and that the system should be able to complete its work without human confirmation if necessary. Sector 9 was 3 city blocks. The sterilization took 40 seconds. The mobile command unit's log registered the action as Sector 9 containment. 3 blocks 40 seconds resolved. The log didn't note that the sector had already been emptied by the time the trigger activated, by the evacuation, by the preceding hours of chaos, by the simple fact that people in Lansheng had been finding reasons to leave their neighborhoods since before midnight. The log noted only the action and the status. Resolved. On the 47 marker map, Sector 9's indicators shifted from yellow to red. 31 green. The transmission went out automatically to the 3 receiving stations with Omega level clearance, updating their copies of the map. In one of those receiving stations, a relay point in a city that wasn't Lansheng, a server, received the update, integrated it, and continued waiting for the next one. The 47 markers remained. The network remained. But one of its operational sites was now missing a server cluster, a transmission log, a scheduling document, and a sterilization authorization chain. It would take them time to realize what was gone. Probably not 48 hours, probably less. Ada was already calculating how much less when she hailed the vehicle that would take her to the extraction point. The driver didn't ask where she'd been. That was the arrangement, and the arrangement was one of the few things in the current situation that was functioning exactly as designed. She looked at the extraction device in her hand and then out the window at Lansheng, going past the damaged, still standing, still producing sound city. And she thought about the 47 markers and the 8 future operation coordinates and the 48-hour window and the 3 receiving stations. 4 problems, 1 extraction device, a timeline that was compressing. She put the device in her pocket and watched the city. The order came through at 6:14 a.m., and it was phrased the way orders were phrased when the people issuing them understood that phrasing was the only thing standing between accountability and consequence. Authorization granted for expanded containment response. Lanxiang Coastal Grid Sectors 1 through 9. All BSAA units to withdraw to outer perimeter by 0700. Non-combatant clearance is the responsibility of unit commanders on the ground. Authorization is time-sensitive. Non-combatant clearance is the responsibility of unit commanders on the ground. Chris read the phrase twice. It meant we are doing this at 0700, whether the civilians are out or not. And if they are not out, that is your fault. He set the radio down on the field table in the mobile command post. A requisitioned office building 2 blocks from the outer perimeter maps covering every flat surface, 5 BSAA personnel running calculations that all produced the same answer and looked at Piers. 46 minutes, Piers said. He was already at the sector map, marking the zones in order of clearability. Sectors 4, 6, and 7 we can clear. Sector 2 is compromised. The Javo concentration makes organized evac impossible. Sectors 1, 3, 5, 8, 9. Civilian population is either already out or not reachable in the window. How many not reachable? Piers didn't answer immediately. That was its own answer. How many Piers? Best estimate 1,400. Could be as low as 900 if the overnight movement was higher than we tracked. Chris looked at the sector map. 900 to 1,400 people in zones that would be sterilized at 0700. Because the thing that had come through the harbor gate had made those zones impossible to hold. And the people making decisions at the authorization level had decided that impossible to hold meant expendable. We're not hitting it, he said, to himself as much as to Piers. We're erasing everything around it. Yes. Pierre's voice stayed even. And the alternative is letting the outbreak reach the coast uncontained. That's what command says. What do you say? Piers looked at the map for a long moment. I say we have 44 minutes and 3 sectors we can actually clear, and standing here doesn't change what happens to the other 6. He picked up his rifle. Sector 4, first. It's closest. He didn't argue because Piers was right, and being right about something terrible didn't make it less right. All BSAA units priority clearance sectors 4, 6, and 7. We have 43 minutes. Move. Sector 4 was a residential block pressed between 2 arterials, and the people in it had been trying to leave since midnight and had been stopped twice once by a Javo roadblock on the eastern arterial that BSAA had cleared at 3 a.m. and once by the bridge on the western arterial that had been dropped at 4:30 a.m. to seal the harbor district. The bridge had been dropped by the same authorization chain that was now ordering the 0700 action. Containment isn't winning, Chris thought, watching the residents of Sector 4 file past the checkpoint at the sector's north end. It's choosing what to lose. He kept that thought to himself and kept counting heads. Leon was 3 sectors east, doing the same thing with fewer personnel. And the decision that Sector 3 couldn't be cleared had been made by someone at the authorization level who had never been inside Sector 3. Leon had been inside it for 20 minutes, and the decision was wrong. Not catastrophically wrong. The math was bad, the timeline was tight, and the people who'd made the call had been working from a map, which was always a compressed and inaccurate representation of a place. But wrong enough. This block is walkable, he said into the radio. 40-something residents, maybe 60. If we get 2 vehicles to the north end of Renman adjacent, not the arterial, the service road, we can get them to the perimeter in 2 trips. Command's response came back in 12 seconds. Sector 3 is classified non-clearable. Do not divert resources. I'm not asking for resources. I'm telling you, I'm doing it. A longer pause. Agent Kennedy, he clicked off and looked at Helena. Find me 2 vehicles. She was already going. The residents of Sector 3 were elderly, predominantly a building that had housed a retirement community. The ground floor accessible, the upper floors requiring elevator access that had failed 6 hours ago. Leon went floor by floor with a master key he'd taken from the building office and got 22 people down the stairs in 11 minutes. Not all of them. Some of them needed to be steadied. Helena came back with 1 vehicle and a man in civilian clothes who said he had a van 2 blocks north. Between them, they ran 3 trips in 31 minutes and reached the perimeter checkpoint with 8 minutes remaining on the authorization window and 63 people who would not have made it otherwise. The checkpoint officer logged them in and said nothing about the timeline. Leon said nothing either. He looked east toward the sectors that had been classified non-clearable from the start, and he did the math that Piers had done an hour earlier and came up with the same number. He didn't say that number out loud either. Jake heard the 0700 deadline through a radio he'd taken from a BSAA unit that no longer needed it, and his response was immediate and unambiguous. They're going to burn the city. They're going to burn the compromised sectors, Sherry said. She was reading the tactical display on the unit they'd been operating from for the last 3 hours, the one they'd set up in a parking structure near the bio-research facility that was their actual objective. There's a difference. From where I'm standing, the difference is about 4 blocks. She looked at the map. The bio-research facility, the one containing the C virus derivative sample that Jake's blood had been flagged as potentially neutralizing, was in Sector 5. Sector 5 was on the non-clearable list. Then we moved the timeline up. We were supposed to have 4 hours. We have... She checked Verti, it's out 37 minutes. Jake looked at the facility's exterior through the 3 stories exterior, security compromised by the night's events, 2 entry points visible from here. 37 minutes was enough to get in, get the sample and get out if nothing went wrong. Something always went wrong. Wesker blood or not, he said, I want it noted that I think this plan is bad. Noted. She was already moving toward the facility entrance. Coming, he went. They were inside the facility when Hulk came through Sector 5. Jake didn't see it. He was on the 2nd floor in the sample storage lab while Sherry covered the ground floor entrance. What he experienced was the building's sudden and comprehensive reconsideration of its structural role, the floor flexing in a way that floors didn't flex. The equipment racks, swaying a glass-fronted storage cabinet, detaching from the wall. It had been bolted to and depositing its contents across the floor with a sound like a small explosion. His radio crackled. Sherry's voice very flat. It's passing south side. Do not exit south. He'd already decided. He found the sample he needed, a sealed case labeled intact despite the cabinet situation, and got back to the stairwell in 40 seconds. At ground level, the south wall of the facility had acquired a new window. Not a designed one. Something had pressed against it from the outside, and the wall had made a decision that favored the pressing. Cold air came through the gap and through it, visible for approximately 2 seconds. Something very large was visible, crossing the street beyond, not running. Not hunting, but redirecting. Angling south-southwest toward the coastal zone, toward the harbor, toward the open water that had apparently replaced dense urban targets as the primary attractor. 2 seconds. Then it was past the gap and gone. South is clear, Sherry said from the doorway. Jake looked at the new window in the south wall. Define clear. Clear of anything actively trying to kill us. The rest is structural. He took the sample case and went through the exit she'd found on the east side. They reached the sector perimeter with 19 minutes remaining, and a BSAA checkpoint officer who looked at the sample case, and then at Jake, and then at Sherry, and then processed the paperwork with the expression of someone choosing not to ask. Ada had been at the perimeter for 40 minutes. She'd reached it before most of the night's decisions had been finalized, which was intentional. She'd read the trajectory early enough to know that the people running the authorization chain would eventually reach the same conclusions, and she'd wanted to be outside the radius when they did. What she was doing at the perimeter was making sure the evidence chain didn't end. The extraction device, the one from Guanghua Road, the one from the freight forwarding office, those copies were already in transit through channels she trusted toward people with the clearance and the inclination to act on what they contained. What she was doing now was the secondary layer. The Omega transmission header, the scheduling document, the cellular transmitter location that she'd flagged for follow-up. She connected the transmission header to a relay she'd set up in a vehicle at the perimeter's edge and pushed it to 2 recipients simultaneously, one who would know what to do with it, and one who would know who else needed to know. The process took 90 seconds. When it finished, she sat for a moment in the vehicle and looked at the city. Lanshang was still standing, damaged, reduced, producing a skyline that didn't match any photograph taken before last week, but standing. The 0700 action would take sectors 1 through 9, not the whole city, not even most of it. What it would take was the part that the night had already taken, plus the people unlucky enough to still be in it. She looked at the transmission confirmation and then at the horizon. Somewhere between the harbor and the open water, the thermal trace she'd been tracking had gone fully dark on her handheld 40 minutes ago. Not lost, she'd learned the difference between a signature the device couldn't read and a signature that had genuinely ceased to be in this geography. This was the second kind. It was gone, or going. The direction it had been traveling when it dropped off her screen was east-northeast, into water deep enough that the city's noise fell away toward whatever the appetite identified as the next concentration worth pursuing. She put the handheld away. She'd found that phrase in the scheduling document, buried in a contingency appendix that Carla's people had apparently written for scenarios they considered unlikely. The phrase had been clinical matter-of-fact, the same register as everything else in the document, a variable to account for, not a catastrophe to prevent. They'd been right that it was a variable. They'd been wrong that it was unlikely. She started the vehicle and went toward at 700 the authorization executed. The sectors burned in a specific sequence infrastructure, first then residential, then the port-adjacent zones that had been the night's primary battleground. The BSAA perimeter held. No units were lost in the action itself. The civilian toll from sectors classified non-clearable would be counted later in documents that would take 3 months to compile and would be classified at a level that ensured the count never became a headline. Chris stood at the outer perimeter and watched the smoke. Piers stood beside him and watched Chris. "Sector 4, Piers said. 6 and 7. We got them out. And the others. And the others." He didn't argue with the fact. "That's also true." Chris didn't say anything for a while. The smoke was the particular gray-black of things that had been built over many years being unmade quickly. He'd seen that color before in other places, and it always looked the same regardless of the geography. "The thing that made this necessary," he said, "it's gone." "Appears so." "So we burned 9 sectors for a threat that had already left." "We burned 9 sectors because the threat had already been through them," Piers said, "and because what it left behind was still active and still spreading. The decision was about the outbreak, not the entity." A pause. "Command will be partially right." "Yes." They stood there until the smoke changed character from the black of active burning to the gray of things that had finished burning. And then Chris turned away from it and began the work of writing a report that would accurately describe what had happened and would be read by people who would accurately redact the parts that made the decision look like what it was. That was also part of the job. He'd known that. He wrote it anyway. 3 days after Lansheng, the official record described the event as a multi-vector biological incident involving a novel C virus strain, coordinated bioterrorism, and catastrophic infrastructure failure. The casualty count was classified at a level that ensured it would not appear in any public document for a minimum of 25 years. The organizations responsible were named in a sealed annex. The primary architect of the operation, identified as a Neo-Umbrella executive, was listed as deceased, confirmed by 2 independent forensic assessments conducted by agencies that had every incentive to confirm it. Everything in the official record was accurate. Everything that made the record incomplete was listed under a single designation: unknown hostile entity, non-biological in origin, classification Omega, status removed from theater, further assessment pending. Pending was doing considerable work in that sentence. What it meant in the vocabulary of people who wrote these documents was, "We don't know what it was, we don't know where it went, and we have decided that not knowing is preferable to explaining." The harbor at Lansheng had been sealed for 51 hours when the last piece of the night closed itself. A Coast Guard vessel running a debris sweep of the outer anchorage reported it first. Not an observation exactly, more a notation of an anomaly that the vessel's crew had no framework for, and so logged with the particular precision of people who were going to let someone else decide what it meant. The log read 0312 hours. Anomalous displacement event grid reference 7 Echo 4. Duration approximately 40 seconds. No vessel contact. Displacement consistent with large submerged mass transiting at high velocity toward open water. No further contact. The log was flagged, reviewed, and reclassified within 6 hours. What the Coast Guard crew had seen, or rather, what they had felt through the hull of their vessel as a pressure wave moving east, northeast at a speed that no submerged biological organism and no manufactured submersible could achieve, was the harbor making room for something that was leaving. Not retreating, not fleeing, leaving with the same deliberate indifference it had brought to every other threshold it had crossed in the preceding 72. The Lanshan harbor was a threshold like any other, a boundary between a place that had been used up and a place that hadn't been touched yet. Across that boundary was open water, and beyond the water were distances that the harbor's charts didn't cover, and beyond those distances were concentrations of heat and mass and energy that the appetite had apparently identified as worth the transit. The Coast Guard log didn't capture what happened next, because what happened next was above the vessel's sensor ceiling and visible only to a weather satellite that was not officially tasked to observe anything in that grid at that hour. The satellite's imagery showed a surface disturbance in the outer harbor lasting 11 seconds, the water displaced, risen, then resettled. Above the disturbance, briefly something that the satellite's object recognition software flagged as unclassified mass non-standard trajectory altitude gain rate, inconsistent with known aircraft profiles. The flag triggered an automated alert to a monitoring station that had 3 personnel on shift, all of whom looked at the alert, looked at the imagery, and then looked at each other. One of them said very quietly, "It's leaving." The other 2 didn't answer. They watched the imagery until the object exceeded the satellite's frame, and the screen showed only open ocean undisturbed, as if nothing had passed through it. The alert was reclassified before the shift ended. The imagery was archived in a folder that required 2 separate clearances to access, and the folder's existence did not appear in the monitoring station's public index. The ocean was quiet. Soon, Chris filed his report on the morning of the 4th day. He wrote it accurately, including the parts that would be removed before anyone outside a very limited distribution list read it. He'd done this enough times to know which parts those were, and he wrote them anyway, because the act of writing them was the closest thing to accountability the situation was going to produce. Piers read it over his shoulder and said nothing. That was its own form of endorsement. When it was filed, Chris closed the laptop and sat for a moment in the quiet of the field office. They'd been allocated a requisitioned space in a building that smelled of someone else's emergency. The specific scent of a place used hard and abandoned quickly. Through the window, Lanshan's intact districts were visible, the skyline wrong in the ways that skylines got wrong after events like this, but still, standing still, producing the ordinary signals of a city that intended to continue existing. He thought about the sectors that were no longer on that skyline. He thought about the number Piers had given him and the number they'd actually evacuated, and the gap between those 2 figures. Piers put a hand briefly on his shoulder. Not a comfort exactly, more a statement of presence, and then removed it and went back to his own work. Chris went back to his. Leon found Helena at the outer cordon, watching the restricted zone. She had her jacket off, despite the temperature, and she was looking at the sealed district with the expression she'd been carrying since Tall Oaks. Grief exactly, something more complicated. The face of someone who had done something that couldn't be undone, and was working out whether that made them responsible for what came after. He stood beside her for a while, without speaking. The cordon held a mix of personnel, military, civilian, emergency management people, with clipboards and people with rifles, all of them managing the boundary between what had happened and what came next. My count was 63, he said finally. She didn't answer immediately. Then, I know. That's 63 that wouldn't have made it if we'd followed the classification. I know. Her voice was steady. I'm not arguing with the math, Leon. He looked at the restricted zone. The smoke was gone now. 4 days of rain had cleared it, and what remained was the particular stillness of a place that had been designated as somewhere else, not a ruin, not a disaster site, somewhere that had been reclassified out of the map. The math doesn't cover everything, he said. She finally looked at him. Whatever she saw in his face seemed to be so. They stood at the cordon until the shift changed, and then they went back to work, which was the only available response to most things. So Jake got the call on the 5th morning. The handler DSO, he assumed, though they never confirmed which agency told him the sample had been received. The preliminary results were promising, and that his participation in the Lanxiang operation was formally acknowledged and formally classified. Formally classified, he repeated. Correct. So nobody knows I was there? Correct. He looked at the ceiling of the hotel room he'd been allocated while the processing was completed. Sherry was in the next room, probably already awake, already doing whatever DSOO agents did on the morning after everything had concluded, being professional about it. I want it on record, he said into the phone, that I think the whole thing was badly managed from the jump and somebody should answer for it. A pause. That's noted. And that if you people need my blood again, the rate goes up. He hung up before they could respond, which felt like the only form of conclusion available to him. He got dressed and knocked on Sherry's door, and they went to find breakfast, which was a normal thing to do. And doing normal things was how you established that the abnormal thing was over. It wasn't entirely over. He suspected it wouldn't be for some time. But breakfast was a start. Ada sent the files on the 6th day. Not all of them, she kept 3 back, the ones that she judged were more useful as leverage than as evidence. And she would keep them until the moment when leverage was the tool the situation required. That moment would come. It always did. What she sent was sufficient to begin the dismantling the 47 markers, the scheduling document, the transmission chain with the Omega designations, the sterilization authorization, with the signatures that led through 4 removes to the people who had made the decisions. Enough to begin. Not enough to finish. Finishing would take time and resources that the people receiving the files would have to arrange for themselves. She trusted them to manage that. She trusted them the way she trusted anything provisionally based on observed behavior, subject to revision. The files transmitted in 90 seconds. She closed the laptop, looked out the window of the location. She wasn't going to describe in any document, and thought about the Coast Guard log, and the satellite imagery, and the monitoring station alert, all of which had been reclassified and archived and designated as things that hadn't happened in any way that mattered. The thing that hadn't happened in any way that mattered was somewhere over open ocean, or past it by now, tracking toward whatever the appetite had identified as the next viable concentration. She didn't know what that was. She suspected nobody on this planet knew, and she suspected that was the correct state of affairs, because the alternative, knowing and being unable to do anything about it, was a worse problem than not knowing. She put the laptop away. 3 items remained in her possession that weren't in any file. She'd sent the cellular transmitter location, the Omega recipient codes, and a single photograph she'd taken of the monitoring station's satellite feed before the alert was reclassified. She looked at the photograph for a moment. The object above the harbor, the trajectory line that the software had drawn before the imagery was archived, the altitude gain that no known aircraft could match. Then she put the photograph away too. Some evidence was better kept than shared. She'd learned that a long time ago in situations that bore a passing resemblance to this one and no resemblance at all. The ocean somewhere was quiet. The record was closed. Incident report. Lanxiang/Tall Oaks/Adonia. Status contained. Biological threat neutralized. Unknown hostile entity removed from theater. Casualties classified. Origin of unknown entity under investigation. Prognosis pending.
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel, and be sure to turn on notification so you won't miss our future video. Thank you for watching, and we will see you next time.